morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Minister Chee, for spending your morning with us. We're very grateful. Let me tell everyone how the next hour, I think the Minister has an hour with us, so let me tell you how it's going to go, or how I hope it's going to go. Minister Chee will have a couple of minutes just to introduce our discussions today. I think he has a lot on his mind, so I will let him get to it. And then after that, I will just take the prerogative to, as quickly as possible, ask him a few questions. My role today is to take as little time as possible and to leave as many questions to the floor as there are. I'm sure there will be. Before I get to ask Mr. Chee to unload what is on his mind, maybe I'll start on a little bit of a fun note and cast him back to last week. I'm sure all of us, I know we were in the newsroom very keenly watching what was happening in a different time zone. Tell us, where were you, and were you watching as closely as everyone else, and at what time and at what stage did you think that things were going one way or the other?
Well, thanks, Jamie, and very good morning, everyone. Certainly, I think the whole world is watching because the election outcomes in the US, which is the world #1 economy and #1 superpower, will have an impact on the rest of us. And which candidate is going to win? What are the policies that will be implemented? Who are the people who are going to form the team? I think those are still some of the questions that people are watching. In the days ahead, in the weeks ahead, I think we will see more of these details becoming clearer, and I think we can then take a look and see how to move forward. Yeah.
Well, I know where we were on Wednesday morning, but before I get to that, I won't get to that. Maybe Mr. Chee, I know you have some introductory remarks for us to get us going, so please go ahead.
Thanks very much. So, Mr. Corbin, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all of you. I want to start off by saying that the international environment that we are in, and this is not just because of last week, but has been happening for a while already, is that the international environment has become more challenging, and especially for small, open economies like Singapore. Because we benefit from a world that is stable, what we have, a rules-based, multilateral global system where there's free trade and the flow of investments. I mean, that's how a small, open economy like Singapore can thrive. But we see some headwinds, some changes in the recent years, and I think the situation is unlikely to improve in the years ahead and could become even more difficult. But that doesn't mean that, therefore, there's nothing we can do or we just give up, because in every situation, even though it's difficult, you have to try and overcome the challenges and then look for where are the opportunities where you can make improvements. This is also part of Singapore's survival strategy as a small state. Stay nimble, stay adaptable, and stay plugged in. So the first thing I think I wanted to highlight is that sometimes when we look at issues, when we discuss issues, including in Parliament, we focus a lot on what's happening domestically. But for a small country like Singapore, I think it's crucial for us to remember that what choices we make, what options we have, what outcomes we face, is not just a function of what we do domestically, but also linked to what's happening around us. So our external environment can have a significant impact on our well-being. So I want to share 3 key points with everyone this morning before we open up for questions. And these are not new points, but I think it's useful for me to just do a recap of how we approach foreign policy and diplomacy. I think the first thing is that we will always put Singapore's interests at the core of our foreign policy. So there are some narratives about neutrality, choosing sides, aligning with one side or the other, who do you pick? I think neither of this accurately describe our foreign policy. Instead, what we want is we want to work with as many friends and partners around the world as possible, but we make decisions based on our principles and based on what is in Singapore's national interest. So when we engage different countries, there will be occasions when we may disagree, and therefore Singapore must be prepared to speak up, even making some tough calls, some tough decisions if necessary, to advance and to protect our interests. And this is also important for us to maintain our credibility in the world. People must take us seriously. They must know that Singapore is a country that we mean what we say, and we will do what we commit. Now, at the same time, I think there are also certain fundamental principles that are important to Singapore. I would say to all countries, but especially to smaller countries like Singapore, such as the rule of law rather than the rule of might, and the territorial integrity. I think that's something that is very important for us. Sovereignty, and a multilateral world order. So institutions like the WTO, the UN, WHO, and many others, I think these are important. In the area of transport, the ones that we deal with more regularly will include the IMO and ICAO. Now, I want to just maybe give one example where, while we want to support the global direction and movements, we must also consider Singapore's national interests. And where we need to make some changes and deviations, we must be prepared to do so. So the example I'll give you is the way in which we introduce the requirement for sustainable aviation fuel. We announced a target earlier this year that starting from 2026, we will impose SAF or SAF levy on flights leaving Changi Airport. And we will start off with a more modest amount, 1%, and then we will look at whether to increase it further, 3 to 5% by 2030. Now, this is a bit different from what some other countries have done. They usually would, the typical approach is they will fix the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that airlines must uplift regardless of the price of the SAF. But since the SAF industry is actually still quite at the early stage and prices can be quite volatile, the concern about doing that is that once you commit, I'm going to do X%, regardless of the cost. What if the costs shoot up? Then you end up paying a lot more. Okay, so the approach that we have taken is a balanced one. We say, okay, we need to set a target. Because if we don't have a target, the suppliers will not want to invest. So we do need to give them some demand certainty. But at the same time, we want to protect our air hub competitiveness, our cost competitiveness. So the way we did it was we said we will set a 1% target based on a certain assumed price. And this assumed price is a reasonable price of what the SAF market, the SAF industry is currently at. If the prices were to shoot up for whatever reason, what it means is that we will buy less. But the financial outlay for the industry will be a fixed amount. Of course, I hope for the other scenario, which is prices go down because supply go up, people invest, supply go up, and then from there we are able to then buy more. So this is an approach that is different from other countries, but we are glad that when we tried this sort of new, unique approach, the International Air Transport Association, IATA, said that our unique approach is sensible. They're usually not so generous with their comments, especially when it concerns additional costs for airlines. But it's also welcomed by other stakeholders because I think it shows that we do need a balanced approach to spur new investments in SAF supply, but at the same time protect passengers, airlines, and our air hub competitiveness. So this is one example. We want to support what ICAO is doing. We want to move towards a more sustainable aviation industry, but we do it in a manner which will still protect and safeguard Singapore's interests. Now, the second point I wanted to share with everyone is, as a small country, we must continue to remain relevant, and I would say, look for ways in which we can add value to the world. We always have a saying, right? The world doesn't owe us a living, and it's true. If Singapore can't add value to the world, we are not able to contribute, we are not relevant, I think the world will just ignore us and pass us by. Makes no difference to them if Singapore exists or not. We can only remain relevant if we remain useful. People find us useful. So one area where we demonstrate this usefulness and relevance to the world is through our connectivity. Because Singapore, as you know, is one of the leading aviation hubs. We are also a leading container port, second largest container port in the world and largest transshipment hub port. And I think these are important because they plug us into the global supply chains. And other countries can see Singapore's continued survival and well-being is not just good for Singapore and Singaporeans, but also good for them. I mean, this is the hard truth. In this practical, pragmatic world, where the world doesn't owe us a living, the way for us to remain relevant is to demonstrate our usefulness. So during COVID-19, we ensured that our air hub and our seaport can remain open. There were ups and downs, there were challenges, crew change, for example, for seafarers. We were one of the first few ports in the world to facilitate this. So seafarers that were stuck on board for many, many months, we worked out a protocol through our tripartite partnership in Singapore between the government, the unions, and the employers. Do it safely, allow our seafarers to have a crew change so that they can return home to their loved ones. We also ensured that our hub port and our air hub continue to support the movement of essential goods like vaccines to aid in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is something that we will continue to do. I think it's important, and there are, as I mentioned earlier, different international organizations beyond transport sector. I think in the financial sector, we have IMF, we have World Bank, we have ADB. I think these are some of the examples of organizations that I hope will still remain relevant in the new world order. Now, I think this is something which we cannot take for granted, because what we have seen in the last few decades, where with America as the world leader, maintaining this world order, rules-based multilateral world order, this is something that I'm not sure how it will develop going forward. There is concern amongst countries, not just in this region, but I think around the world, that if America were to turn more inward-looking, rather than to see its role as the world leader to also maintain world stability, world peace, and to allow the various countries in different parts of the world to continue to grow and prosper. And of course, this is not just doing charity. Yeah? America will also benefit. So that was what happened in the last few decades. But whether this will continue, I think we will have to wait and see. We hope so. And one of the key points that we hope we can persuade our American friends is that it is still very important for the US to remain engaged in this region, in Asia Pacific. This is where the growth will be, opportunities, and also I think this is where we hope America will continue to stay engaged, not just in terms of security and defense, but also in the trade, investments, and economic development. And I believe there are many things that US companies can continue to do in this part of the world. They already have a very strong presence here. And I think there are many opportunities for them to do more. So I want to end off with my third point, which is Singapore's approach is to, while we maintain a principled and consistent approach in our dealings with other countries, try to make friends with as many countries as possible. I mentioned earlier that there will be some areas where we may disagree, but try to seek out areas of common interests and try to find ways to resolve areas of disagreement. In Chinese, there's a phrase, 求同存异. You seek out areas of common interests, and then you try to deal with some of the differences in a proper way. so that we are still able to work together, we are still able to find win-win opportunities. And there are indeed many challenges that will require us to take this approach, such as climate change, dealing with the next pandemic, cyber threats. I think these are some of the many examples. And in many of these cases, like climate change and pandemics, it's not a national issue. It's actually an international, global issue. You can't deal with climate change alone as a single country. You need the world as a whole to work together in order for us to mitigate the impact. Same for pandemics. We saw that with COVID-19. No point just dealing with it within your own borders. You need a global response in order for this to be effective. So I think the point I want to make is also that in this more disruptive, turbulent world that we foresee in the years ahead, one very critical thing for Singapore to be able to do well in such an environment would be to continue to maintain a principled and consistent approach in our dealings with various countries so that people take us seriously and they know that we mean what we say what we mean, and when they deal with us, they know Singapore is a trustworthy partner. Second, continue to look for ways in which we can add value, stay useful to the world, stay relevant to the world, because I think if we don't, we cannot expect people to then want to pay attention to us because we are such a small country. So we must continue to do well, staying ahead, doing well. I think it's not an option, it's a must. And lastly, try and find common areas of interest, common challenges that we need to tackle, win-win opportunities, make as many friends as possible, especially, I think, with countries in our region. We can talk about this a little bit more during the Q&A, but I think we can do a lot more to further strengthen the integration within ASEAN so that this region as a whole can do well and can continue to attract investments, and not just from outside the region, but also within the region. Yeah. So with that, I will end my opening remarks and look forward to the Q&A of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Chee. One quick point before I ask my first question. If at any point when I ask for questions from the floor, please just raise your hands. I'll ask you to stand up and then introduce yourself. I'll try again, as I say, to let you ask as many questions as possible. I will start really, Minister Chee, at as high a level as possible, and you raised many good points. And just listening to what you were talking about, you raised many interesting points, right? Which we all know about: multilateralism, rule of law, principles, multilateral organizations and institutions, and how it's so important to us and to the world order. But increasingly, as you say, not just governments, but I will also say people are finding that these rules are becoming less and less relevant to them, and that the rules also, at some point, need some degree of updating or renewing or changing altogether. While we, as Singapore, and I'm sure many countries which are represented in this room, want to continue strengthening the multilateral order and the rules of engagement, it's getting harder and harder. So how, firstly, would countries like ours persist? Is it just a matter of doubling down and saying it again and again so that people will start believing it? That's one. Is there anything else that we can do? And secondly, in terms of our own population and populations in other countries, clearly there is some sense that rules don't work for them in some places, or at least the rules that were set post-World War II, the Bretton Woods system that led to the creation of the WTO, WHO, and all of that, don't seem to be working as well as they should. How do we convince our people and other peoples around the world that that there's no other option? How would you do that?
Thanks, Jimmy. I think no set of rules or governing system is going to be perfect. If you look at what we have today, and then we got to ask the question, so what is the alternative, right? So yes, there are some areas that I think we do need to improve, we do need to tweak to keep up with times and to address some of the gaps. But if you abandon this current rules-based multilateral world order, then what do you replace it with? And is that replacement, that alternative, perfect? Unlikely. Probably come with its own set of problems. Probably worse. So we are of the view that this system overall is still the right system. It's a bit like in politics. People talk about democracy. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. But as Winston Churchill said, it is a worse system except for all the other alternatives. So the key, I think, is to look at what can we do? What are the improvements we can make? So I will just highlight one. You know, we talk about trade, investments. One very critical thing we must ensure is that this can ultimately translate into better lives for our people. And you can't just persuade people with rhetoric. You can't just keep repeating those points and then say, that's the way to go because this is conceptually correct. I don't think that's going to persuade people. I mean, you need to win people over, ultimately, with their actual experiences, their lived experiences, to say, yes, my life has been better. I mean, that was the key message that Mr. Donald Trump asked the American voters. Is your life better than 4 years ago? So I think ultimately that is the acid test. Whatever system we put in place, whether world orders and trading systems or political systems, I think ultimately the key determinant for voters, for our citizens, is that can we translate these into outcomes that they and their families can feel is positive for them. We take trade, for example. One of the downsides is that when you have an open system with global trade, investments, competition, in any economy, there will be some sectors, some companies that will do well, and there will be other sectors that will not do so well. And for those sectors that do well, people are happy, the workers are happy. But for those sectors that don't do well, then what do? Do you just leave them alone and say, well, too bad, you fend for yourself? Or do you take a different approach and say, no, we don't want to stop economic restructuring, we don't want to stop trade, but we need to do something to help the workers there. Because if they are affected and their livelihoods are affected, their jobs are affected, I think it's going to be very difficult to persuade those workers to support an open trading system. Because they will see all the downsides and no upsides for them. So ultimately, I think that's what governments need to do. We need to do the right thing to grow the macroeconomic pie, but also do the right thing to make sure that we tackle at the micro level, at the individual level, at the family level, the help and the assistance for people to make that transition. In Singapore, that's what we hope to do. We are going to invest a lot more in Skills Future to help our workers to make this transition. We don't think we can build walls, put barriers to protect them. That would not be effective. But we need to invest a lot more in helping our workers to stay relevant and to be able to have that confidence that their employability, their livelihoods would not be affected.
Thanks, Minister. From going to starting off from as big picture as I thought we should, central to a lot of the changes that we are seeing now, obviously, is the US-China relationship, and I wanted to get to that. It's a bit quaint. I'm sure you remember. I'm sure many of us in this room remember. As recently as 2009, there was this very quaint sort of series of dialogues called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue that the US and China set up. And it was only 15 years ago. But they did have this, and they did have many rounds of dialogues at the highest levels. But now you fast forward, and here we are at 2024, where it almost seems like a different age altogether. So the question as far as US-China relations, and because everything centers around that increasingly, is how do you think we got to the stage that we are today, where the entire dynamic has changed? Now you have, as you say, President Trump in power, or will be in power, and that again fundamentally raises a lot of questions as to how he's going to deal with China as a competitor. But looking ahead for the similar, therefore, 15 years ago, we were in a different place. If you were to fast forward 15 years from now, firstly, tell us, how do you think we got here? And what does the next 10, 15 years for us look like as far as the relationship between the two of them goes?
Well, I think one of the fundamental factors that's affecting the US-China relations is actually strategic competition between the number one and the number two superpower and economy in the world. Not something that is surprising, but you can compete in some areas. It doesn't mean that you have to end up with a confrontation. So that's what we hope will be the outcome. Competition, I think, is unavoidable and may not in itself be a bad thing. But if competition then leads to confrontation, conflict, then I think we have a big problem. So we hope that between the US and China, they can continue with their dialogues. They can continue to look for areas of common interest. And it's not a binary 1 or 0. I think there are different issues can have a different response. In some areas where the interests may align, even competitors can still work together. In other areas, yes, there may be differences, maybe even opposing interests, and it's not possible to reconcile fully. But then find a way to be able to keep the dialogues going, keep the conversations going, and don't end up with something more serious like a conflict or confrontation. So I think that's broadly what I hope to see. If you take the US, for example, the Singapore's relationship with the US is a very important and strategic one for us. The US and us have strong collaborations in many domains, economic, defense, people-to-people ties. Our US-Singapore FTA, this year we're celebrating the 20th anniversary signing of this FTA. We are the only ASEAN country that has an FTA with the US. And it's a good quality FTA, and we hope that this will allow us to continue to encourage that investment flow and trade flow. The US is our largest trading partner in services, and it's also our largest foreign investor. And I think not just for Singapore, I think many countries in ASEAN too. And in turn, Singapore is US, it's the third largest Asian investor in the US. Our bilateral trade has almost tripled over the last 20 years since we signed the US-Singapore FTA. And it's now at more than $200 billion. And in fact, one important point that I think we will remind our friends from the US is that the US has a trade surplus with us since 2004, and it has reached almost $28 billion in 2023. And there are nearly 6,000 US companies that are based in Singapore, and our trade and investments with the US actually involves more than 30 states supporting over 270,000 American jobs. So this is an important relationship for Singapore, but I hope also for the US. And as I said at the beginning, I believe there's more that we can do to support the growth and the presence of American companies that want to grow in this region. Singapore is a good place for them to put their headquarters for the region, for them to site some of the functions in their global operations. Of course, not everything can be here. I think it's not possible to have all your operations in one location. It will be a distributed supply chain and production chain. But Singapore certainly, I think, can play a role for US companies looking to expand in this region. So we hope that with the Trump administration, and we have to see who else will form this administration. I think he has named a few people, but still work in progress. We will see who are the other members of the administration, and we will reach out to them, we will work with them. We had a good working relationship with the first Trump administration. I think if you recall, Mr. Trump chose Singapore as the location for his meeting with Mr. Kim in 2018. And while we may not fully agree with all the different policies, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean that we cannot work together. And there are many more areas where I think we can look for win-win opportunities between us and the US. For China, it's the same. We just had our JCBC meeting yesterday. It doesn't mean that we agree with China on everything. In fact, on some areas, we do disagree. But we explain to our friends from China that Singapore is a sovereign country. We do have our interests. And in areas where we disagree, we will explain why. But there are also, like the US, many areas where we can work together with China. So what I'm hoping is that Singapore can remain friends with both US and China. Singapore can be a place where different countries, including American companies, Chinese companies, but also companies from the region can come and use this as a regional hub, use this as an innovation launch pad to start new ventures, bring in new ideas, and then hopefully the things that we do here can not just benefit Singapore, but will also benefit the region as a whole.
I'm going to ask one more question before I open up the floor, and I'm giving you this heads up so you can start thinking of your questions as well. I wanted to now maybe bring the conversation a bit closer to home for you, and I think underlying a lot of what you just said is the openness of populations to globalization, and looking at ourselves as Singapore. Two questions. One, as a representative of the so-called new 4G leadership that Singapore is looking forward to, how much time do you think you and your colleagues have for foreign policy? After all, I think it's admittedly a reality that our domestic politics is probably getting a little bit more contested. Domestic sort of local concerns are getting a bit more acute, as they are around the world. So, if you were to look back towards a different time, do you think the Singapore leadership has as much bandwidth for foreign policy and geopolitical issues as we may have had in the past? And as a subset of that then, also is the openness and the mindsets of our population. Do you think we are still as open towards sort of, the international order, international talent, international companies? Do you think we are still strong? Do you think we're still as open? Or do you think, again, that is just another one of those issues that's becoming and will become more contested locally and domestically?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is diplomacy starts at home. So if internally we are not united, we're not cohesive, I think it's going to be much more difficult for us as a country to be able to engage others. Because if internally we can't even agree, how do we then put forth a united position with other countries? So I think that's the first thing. We need to perhaps invest more time, more effort to explain the reasons why we take certain positions, why certain approaches are ultimately in the best interest of Singapore and Singaporeans. So we engage our people, help them to understand what's happening around the world, what is the impact on Singapore, on our lives, and then what can we do as a country together. So I would first want to say that I think that has been important in the past and remains important now and into the future. And why is that so? It's because if we don't handle our external environment, our diplomacy, our international affairs effectively, it's going to shrink the space for Singapore to operate. In the global economy, our position as a hub will be affected. When it comes to regional stability and security, our well-being will also be affected. So this has real implications on our lives. It's not just conceptual, theoretical, academic discussions. These are going to be things that will affect the lives of Singaporeans. And if we don't do it well, it will also affect the lives of our children and our grandchildren, because whatever we do now, whatever decisions we make now, can have an impact on them, including, for example, in the area of climate change. If we fail to take the necessary steps now to mitigate the impact of climate change, and we leave it till too late, in the future, we are going to leave them a very problematic situation. So these are things which I hope we can persuade Singaporeans to understand and to support what we need to do as a country. And of course, in the process of doing so, there will be questions asked, there will be concerns raised, and I think it's for us to continue to engage and to explain. Forge a consensus, if possible. If not, then at least get a better understanding, a better appreciation of the importance of diplomacy, dealing with international affairs effectively. The second thing I think is important is what I mentioned earlier, that ultimately we need people to see the benefits of Singapore adopting this open and connected approach. We want to be open to investments, to talent. We want to remain connected to global supply chains, to the global economy. We want to stay plugged in. And we need to convince our people that ultimately doing so will be better for them in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their well-being, their quality of life, compared to the alternative. Now, this doesn't mean, Jamie, that if we stay open, there are no challenges and there are no problems. If you keep the windows open, some insects may fly in from time to time, but it doesn't mean, therefore, that you live in a cave and shut everything out, right? So you do need to deal with the problems that come with staying open, but I think ultimately that is still a better overall approach compared to turning inwards and then building walls all around us, cutting ourselves off from the world. Especially for a small country like Singapore, I think that will be disastrous. We can't afford to do that. So our only viable option is to stay open and connected. And if there are then downsides to doing that, there are risks that come with doing that, then we have to deal with those downsides properly. Use the resources that we generate from the growth that we can then channel to tackling some of the downside risks. So in particular, I think the one that I wanted to highlight, which I think is going to become more and more salient in time to come, is that globalization should not end up making people feel worse off, and that their lives and their children's future will become worse compared to a system where they start turning inwards. I think if people feel that if I turn inwards, my life becomes better, then you can't blame them for taking that position, right? So ultimately, it's for us as government to persuade our people that when you stay open, you stay connected, yes, there are some downsides, but overall, the net benefits will outweigh the downsides. And then we use the resources that we generate from the growth to be able to then help those who are affected by global competition and by new business models and technology affecting their jobs, affecting their lives. I think that is still a better approach. But we need to do the second part effectively and properly. Because if you can't, then you only see the downsides, but there's no safety net and there's no benefit. But if you do it well and people can see the benefits, even if it's not immediate, they can see light at the end of the tunnel, they can see a better future for themselves and their children. There's hope, there's optimism that there can be a better future. I think we can persuade the majority of the population to support this. So I want to end off by saying that it is not a disconnected exercise. Politics, economics, diplomacy, actually at the end, they are all linked. And if you do it well, the benefits of the economic policy and the trade policy and your foreign diplomacy will then give you the political support that you need to continue with those good policies. So policy and politics actually need to go together. You have good policies, it will help you to have the resources to be able to provide the assurances and the safety nets to get a good outcome for the people, and that in turn can give you a good environment for good politics to thrive. And good politics in turn allow the government to continue with good policies. Okay, so I think I would like to say that these two need to go hand in hand, and we need to find a way for the virtuous circle to continue. And if you don't do this well, you could end up like what we see in some other countries. It can become a vicious circle. The politics become dysfunctional, and then that in turn affects the policies, and the policies then are unable to generate the benefits for good politics to continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chee. Excellent points. Question time. So for those of you out there, please put up your hands and identify yourselves. There are mics around the room which will be passed to you. Gentleman right at the end. I can't see you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Minister. My name is Dylan Loh from Nanyang Technological University. My question relates to ASEAN. Earlier in your opening remarks, you mentioned the importance of ASEAN. Foreign Minister yesterday in Parliament also mentioned ASEAN as that first concentric circle of friends. But there is a view that ASEAN is increasingly becoming less relevant. There's also a risk that other ASEAN member states are de-emphasizing and deprioritizing ASEAN. So my question to you is, are there alternatives to ASEAN if that risk materializes? And I guess my second part of the question is, what more can Singapore do to ensure that ASEAN remains central in this part of the world and not just another institution or forum out of many other institutions or forums that remains central? Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. I think the construct of ASEAN is something which has led to peace and stability in this part of the world for many years. So while it is not a perfect system, and there are some areas where we can continue to look at, see how we can improve, overall, I would say it has achieved its purpose. How do we go forward? I would like to suggest that there are two areas, at least. First is to identify what are some of the common challenges or common benefits for the region as a whole that we can work on. ASEAN has many good things going for it. A younger population, rising middle class, and we do have some fast-growing economies in this part of the world too. And for US, for China, for India, Japan, Korea, for many of the major economies, they do look at ASEAN with some optimism and some interest. So I think we do have some positive things going for us. But how do we then translate these positive momentum into actual positive outcomes? So first, I think we do need to strengthen the integration within ASEAN. To be realistic, I don't think we will become like the EU, not quite like that. But there are areas, whether is it in trade, in investments, in capability building, in infrastructure, like the ASEAN Power Grid, for example. These are examples of projects that I think can be win-win for the whole region. ASEAN Power Grid has been talked about for a long time. We are now seeing some positive movements, not sort of jumping from where we are now to a fully connected grid like what we have in Europe. I don't think that's realistic. But sort of smaller regional grids being developed, and then later on this can be joined up to form a larger ASEAN power grid. This is important because it will allow us to tap the full potential for renewable energy in this region. We have some places in ASEAN where there will be excess energy, renewable energy, more than what they can use locally. So if they don't export this, they don't transmit this to other places where the demand is higher, actually it's a wasted opportunity. At the same time, you have countries like Singapore, for example, and a few other places, cities, where it may be harder for you to generate enough renewable energy domestically. So therefore, I think this ASEAN Power Grid makes a lot of sense for the region as a whole, but we require investments, grid infrastructure, renewable energy capacity, and these are then opportunities for countries around the world and also international organizations to come in. So that's just one area. In transport also, I think we are keen to see how we can strengthen the supply chain resilience in ASEAN between our maritime ports and also our flight connectivity. So those are just some of the areas. If we can do this, I think it will allow us as a region to achieve our potential. The second one, I think, will be to look at how we can deal with some of the common challenges like climate change, pandemics, and actually for many of the countries in ASEAN, while some are young, but there are actually a few countries like Singapore where we are facing aging populations. So how to deal with the challenges of healthcare, looking after an aging population. I think that will also be an area of common interest for some of the ASEAN countries. And it's also an opportunity, I think, for us to look at what are some of the new investments, innovations that we can test out with the populations in the different parts of ASEAN. And if it works well, I think some of these can become solutions that can help other regions, other parts of the world. So that's what I hope we can do. And if you look at ASEAN today versus, say, 10 years ago, I think we have made some progress. We're not quite where we want to be yet. Still a lot more work to be done. But I think I'm cautiously optimistic that the way forward, I think we will see closer integration, we will see more collaboration, we will see more investments coming into this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next question, anybody? Bhagia, table 8. Can a mic so that everyone can hear you? One's coming.
Morning, everyone. I'm Bhagia from ST's US Bureau. Minister, my boss, Jamie, just asked you about, your understanding of what lies ahead for us, say, 15, 20 years from now. But my question is just this year, Trump administration, not yet administration, but president-elect, he seems to have got off on a good start with the economy. The stock markets are rising. Asset classes across, all kinds of assets, they're just rising. The US economy as such seems to be doing very well. Do you expect that to endure during this administration?
Mr. Mayor, I'll get two questions in. So I think behind there's a question, yeah. So I'll allow you to answer two questions at the same time.
Thank you very much. I'm Tadeusz Chomicki. I'm the new head of mission of the Republic of Poland here. And I have a comment rather than question coming out of my previous job until last week, a week ago, which was a cyber and tech ambassador for Poland. And I would like to bring your attention and ask for a possible comment on the problem of the disinformation and campaigns in the elections all over the world. This year is supercharged year, of course, with the elections in the European Union, the US, and many other countries. And according to the World Economic Forum, the Global Risk Report 2024, disinformation is likely to become the major threat, global threat. It was in the next 2 coming years. So we've been, many societies, many electoral processes were subject to both domestic and foreign actors, disinformation and manipulation campaigns, which are very dangerous because they eradicate the trust in democratic processes. They enhance the polarization of the societies. They increase the populism and easiness of people not trusting their own institutions and the processes, as a result, imposing threats to the integrity of the public institutions and stability of statehoods. So these processes we see as very dangerous, and I believe that we require more enhanced cooperation to increase the resilience against such processes. And because the results of elections are not only domestic matter, as you, Minister, also pointed out often in your remarks, but they also the results of the elections are influencing our foreign policies, and as a result, they influence the global trade, the global safety, security. I believe we need to cooperate closely in increasing the resilience to such disinformation campaigns. And I want to praise Singapore here because for years I have very good cooperation with Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, and we share values of stability and rule-based order in the international relations, including the cyberspace. So if you think you can comment on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome to Singapore, Ambassador. I'll leave it to you. Minister, you have a good 5 minutes, and maybe this will bring us to the end, but let's go ahead, Minister.
Thanks. Thank you to both of you for your questions. First question on whether the current positive momentum can endure. Well, I think first, the Republicans have now, I would say, full control, the president and both houses. So I think that will give them, the US administration, more sort of a firmer hand to carry out the policies. I think that will help because sometimes it's the gridlock that affects some of the progress of the policies to be implemented. I think we could remember that last time when Mr. Trump was president, we didn't have an ambassador, a US ambassador here in Singapore because the nominee could not get approved. So I hope that won't happen again this time around. We will be able to see the policies being implemented in a quicker and more decisive manner. So that's one. I think that's I'll say it's a plus. The second one is that I think the impact that countries are watching, and including, I think, today's Straits Times has a very good article by Professor Chan Heng Chee, talked about the impact on different countries. And one of the points that she made was it's still a bit early days. We need to wait and see what are some of the policies. Because, in US presidential elections, it's often the case that you make certain statements during the campaign, but after you win, you may calibrate a little bit because then you need to govern. So you may not implement every single thing that you say during the campaign because when you need to govern, there are trade-offs and you do need to calibrate. So let's wait and see what are some of the policies that we put in place. But overall, what gives me confidence that I think the American economic engine will continue to remain strong is because the US is still the world's strongest and most innovative economy. And one of the strengths is the policy of welcoming talent from around the world. I actually don't think that Mr. Trump will stop the inflow of talent. I think he made it quite clear. He had a debate with someone about immigration. He said what he's against is illegal immigrants. But he's not stopping the inflow of talent from around the world. And I think that policy, if it continues, will allow the US to remain the most innovative and most competitive economy. And the US companies are also not sitting still and not just being satisfied with where they are now. I mean, you look at all these new developments coming up, not just within the US economy, but also when they invest overseas, including in Singapore, these then also become new engines of growth. So overall, I think I am optimistic. Whether the stock market will move up and down, I mean, that one is difficult to say. But if you take a longer term view, I think don't bet against the US. If you look at how the country as a whole, because of its talent pool, its innovative culture, and I think very importantly, this desire to always want to make tomorrow better. I think if those elements can remain, the US economy will still be a very formidable one. And we hope that the links that we have with the US and the US companies can also allow Singapore to benefit from this rising tide. Ambassador, your question about disinformation, I fully agree with you. I think you said it very well. Ultimately, we want the political campaign to be one where people make decisions based on facts and not because they were misled. There are two types of disinformation that we are concerned about, and in Singapore's case, we pass legislation to deal with both. One is fake news and false information. So we have a law that can deal with that. We will direct the party that puts up the fake news to put up a factual correction so that the viewers can see clearly the original version and the correction. And you decide which one you believe. But there is a process to point out, to call out these false fake news, false narratives, and then to have a process in place to make sure that people are given accurate information to make up their own minds. The second one is to deal with foreign interference. Because as you pointed out, this is also a rising concern. So we need safeguards as well, so that ultimately the politics in a country should be decided by its own citizens. So Singapore politics should be decided by Singaporeans. Polish politics should be decided by the Polish people and not by outsiders. So I think that principle is quite important. So we have put in place legislation, but Ambassador, as you know, this is a little bit of a cat and mouse game. For every safeguard you put in, there will be a new sort of a way to get around it, right? A new method to circumvent it. So therefore, this mutual learning and comparing notes, learning from one another's best practices to continuously level up our capabilities, I think will be very important. The other one I thought would be equally important is this. We need credible, trusted sources that people can turn to. So there may be a lot of information, especially on social media, that you can't 100% prevent, but if there are trusted, credible sources that people know information is accurate, especially during a crisis or during a hotly contested election where a lot of news flowing around, people know where to turn to if they want accurate information. So in our case, one of these sources would be our mainstream media. And that is why, despite the challenges that we face because of the social media and the changing business model for both broadcast and also print media, actually now more and more moving towards digital media, this is something which we need to continue to invest in to build up the capabilities to ensure that the mainstream media as trusted, credible sources can continue. So that the public, when they are confronted with different sources of information, some completely false, some half-truths, and some accurate, they know where to turn to get accurate information. And then they decide what they want to do with the information. They decide who they want to vote for. They decide what decisions they want to make. But they need accurate information to enable them to make good decisions. So I think that is something that will be also quite important for governments around the world to pay attention to. Yeah, thank you.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for the call out for the mainstream media. And by sheer coincidence, because you've given us a thumbs up, we're going to give you time for one more question. I'm told there's maybe 5 more minutes for one more question from the floor. So please go ahead. Otherwise, I will do so, which I probably do not feel like doing. One more question from the floor. Yeah, I think that's Shafali right at the end.
Good morning, Minister. I was listening to your talk, and in the early part of your talk, you mentioned about the importance of connectivity to stay relevant. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on how do we continue to focus on connectivity in a tech-led world which is both uniting and dividing countries, people, institutions across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think connectivity has two dimensions. There's the physical connectivity, I mean your infrastructure, your ports, your airports, your planes, your ships, your trains, to bring people from one point to another. I think that's one. And continued investments, I think, will be required in that domain to put in place new facilities, new infrastructure, because in some parts of the world that's still a bit lacking. But also, I think, to renew aging assets, upgrade aging assets. And in this area, I think one important trend that we need to focus on is how to make our transport and our connectivity infrastructure more environmentally sustainable. So that going forward, it is not just serving its purpose of connecting people and bringing goods from one part of the world to another, but to do so in a sustainable manner. The other dimension of connectivity is actually the people-to-people linkages. And this part, yes, I think some amount of substitution, if I may put it that way, through digital media and social media, internet, may take place, but I actually don't think people want to rely on that alone. That's why, despite being able to view videos showing other countries, people still want to travel, right? If you watch videos versus if you are there in person, experiencing it firsthand, tasting the food, meeting the people, experiencing the culture, I think the latter is certainly better. So I hope that with better infrastructure, better flight connectivity, better transport options, actually the world can have more travel, more interactions between people from different countries. Because I believe ultimately that is one of the safeguards against this world turning inwards and not wanting to pay attention to what's happening around us. The best way to, or one of the best ways to counter that is actually to invest in exposing our people, especially our younger generation, to different cultures around the world. So I shared, for example, with some of the Chinese government leaders when I met them, both yesterday and also previously, that I think one of the best ways for people to understand China better is to have more international students and young people go to China for internship, for exposure, for exchange programs, learning journeys, because then they can see for themselves what exactly is happening in China, what are the good things, what are some of the not so good things, but then they can decide for themselves. But it's a first-hand experience. I think it's much better than just reading through books, watching videos. And even better, if you get to know friends from that country, I think that will allow you to have not just a one-off, but a continued engagement and interaction to further deepen your understanding of the other culture. So the reverse is true. I think we need to encourage more people from China to travel and to go to the West, go to America, understand what's happening in America. I think these are some of the interactions that will help to bring people closer and hopefully bridge some of the differences and find common areas of interest and win-win opportunities. But you can't force this. You can't achieve it overnight. You got to do it through a gradual, sort of a long-term process. A bit like education. You do need to invest in it, even though the outcomes may not be so apparent immediately, But if you look at it over a certain period, I think it will bear fruit later. Yeah, thank you.
Minister Chee Hong Tat, you certainly have left the room with a lot of food for thought and teed us up very nicely for the panels that will come. Thank you for spending your morning with us. To all of you on the floor, thank you for listening. I wish we had more time for questions, but a round of applause for Minister Chee Hong Tat. Thank you so much.